Thank you, Ron. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. So today in this session, we'll be talking about AWS Security Reference Architecture, which is a public guidance that was released by AWS. Before that, just for introductions, I'm Avik Mukherjee. I am a senior security consultant, part of AWS Global Services Security. I am the lead author of the security reference architecture, but again, it's a work of a whole team. So as part of the global services team, we directly work with some of our customers on some of their hardest problems. And our overall objective is to give our customers the technical ability and the confidence to move their sensitive workloads to cloud. So what I'll be discussing today mainly comes from the security reference architecture, but most importantly, it is driven by these customer interactions. The real use cases, the real approaches, the real solutions that we have seen in the field. And we have tried to summarize that in the security reference architecture, or we lovingly call it the SRA. So let's get into that. So today we'll look at what is the SRA and why it should matter to you, share some highlights. It is a comprehensive guidance, so won't go into the details, but will provide some navigation guide so that it whets your appetite and you can take a deeper look at it later. And we'll wrap it up with some actionable next steps so that it's not just another presentation. You can take some action out of it and act upon it. So before we do that, as Ron said, wanted to keep this a bit interactive and also gather feedback from you all. Ron, I think I again lost the...
Oh, okay. Which poll question did you want to say? I can launch it.
Poll one.
Is that the one about security diagrams or?
Yeah, the first one.
Okay.
Yeah, so I wanted to do some polls, again, to make it interactive and to understand the audience landscape. So if you can take a few seconds to answer the poll and maybe...
We're running about 1/3 each. Can you see that, Avik?
Yeah.
Yep. I think it's about a third. Okay.
Okay, so if you can end it, I think it would give you the results. Okay. So let's move to the next poll question. Yeah, Ron,
Okay.
if you can.
Yep. Which poll question you want to do now about security architecture?
Yes.
Okay. This is good. We always like to get a little bit of feedback here, see what's on people's mind, just so no one's gazing off. Oh, we're getting lots of people here. Oh, they definitely think having a formal architecture would help.
Okay, so that sounds good. So we are in the right direction. So yeah, if you can end the poll.
Okay. And do you want a third one, or you want to just get right into?
Yeah, I'll get right into it, and there is a placeholder for the next one.
Yep.
So yeah, so based on the questions we asked, so we got those, as I said, we work with the customers day in and day out. So we got some questions from our customers. So at AWS, 90% of what we build is based on our customer feedback. So we work backward from them and start building anything. So why did we build a security reference architecture? So as you may know or have seen if you have interacted with AWS, there are multiple AWS security-focused services and some services that are truly not security services, but they have security features that help you achieve some security goals. Now, there are multiple documentation about the services, best practices, how to use them, when to use them. So we have a lot of this. So why another guidance? So in our interactions with our customers, sometimes we see that customers are overwhelmed by these choices. Like they like the choices, but sometimes they are overwhelmed. And they ask us, like, When should I use what and where and how? Can you give me an overall picture of my security architecture? Like, how should it look like? What should I do? Where and when should I use all these services? So they wanted a holistic view. Second is, again, you have so many AWS security services, but are they individual services or should they work in together? If they need to work in together, where does they fit in? Like, how help me solve this puzzle? The third question or feedback we got is, so I am using all the services, but how do I visualize my security environment? Right. So as humans, we comprehend visual things better, right? And second thing is, how do I collaborate this with other teams? Like, not everyone in my team are developers that can take a look at a code and understand what my environment is doing. So how do I interact with other teams and make this a collaborative effort? So to answer all these questions, we came up with what we call the AWS Security Reference Architecture. So what is the SRA? So SRA is a set of prescriptive guides, examples, and design consideration for deploying full component AWS security services in a multi-account environment. And why I focus on that is today, uh, most of our customers, as they try to scale out their business, they adopt a multi-account environment. So at the core of this SRA is, if you see on your left, is this one-page architecture diagram. I know it is a bit convoluted, it is, but we wanted to put everything in one page. Again, this is just that visualization aspect that it is easier to comprehend what I have at one place. Now, obviously, the single page architecture diagram needs guidance that why the services are there, what are their functionality, how they work together. And we explain those in this public guidance, which is an HTML guide document, which explains what the services are, why are they in those accounts, how they interact with each other, and design considerations like so there is no one right design, right? There can be alternatives. So we talk about those design considerations that what you should take into consideration when you are changing your architecture. Now, these are all the guidance, but you need to actually build those things out, right? So we have created a code repository where we put samples of what we talk about those architectures in a modularized format. So you can take those and deploy and build your version of this architecture. So while doing this, we have three tenets that we kept in mind. One is because it talks about security and AWS, within AWS, security is priority, we want to make it a very high bar for the document and the code repository. Secondly, is we want to make sure that this is a customizable reference architecture. We don't call it an architecture. It is a reference architecture, and we encourage you to take this and customize it as per your organization need. And third, what we want is to make this a living document. Now, it's not a code, so it's a bit hard to make it living, but we try to update it periodically and we have been successful at least getting an update out every quarter. So this guide was launched in June of 2021, and since launch, it saw a significant customer interest. So as of today, we have around 262K visits to this guide with 83K unique visitors that are referencing this guide. The code repository has around 161K visits with 3K repo clones. So people are not just seeing it, they are using it in their world. So now we talked about what the SRA is. So how will you use it? Like at what stage of your journey in the cloud would you use it? So we see some patterns coming out. Firstly, is if you are starting your cloud journey on AWS, you can use the SRA to define your target state. Now, that is simple. You have something to go for, and you won't build everything that SRA calls out on your day one, but at least you have a target that you can aim for, and you can plan out accordingly. So, for example, if you are a startup, yeah, you won't go with a 10 plus account on your day one, but at least you can plan for things that once we start to scale, once we achieve velocity, this is what we should aim for. So that when you're building small blocks, you plan for the future. If you are an organization that is already operating on AWS, you can review and revise your existing security architecture. So you can take this and revise what you have and any deviations that you see. Out of this too, you can execute any changes with the code repository that we have provided. And some of the other things are you can learn about AWS services, how they work together, best practices, and drive an organization-wide discussion. So once you have this architecture in place, you can share it with your teams and get their input and talk about what you want to do and what are the things that needs to be done to get there. Okay. So are we saying that you have to do everything that the SRA talks about? Absolutely not. Like, if you want to do things differently, that is perfectly okay. But make sure that it is an informed decision. Like, you have a documentation or an understanding of why you are deviating from the designs that has been recommended. And they may be perfectly fine for your organization, given your tech stack, given your business need, given your team working. But as long as you understand those and you document that for future, that is the aim of the collaboration and the documentation. So we learned about why SRA, what the SRA is, how you use it, but then what is the objective of the SRA? Is it to use some security services? No. The objective of the SRA is to help your business ship more application faster and more securely. So that's the business that you are in, right? So how does SRA does this? So if you have a strong baseline architecture, you can port in more workloads onto that architecture without having to go back to the drawing board and refactor a bunch of things as you are scaling out or as you are becoming more security sensitive. Your initial few workloads may not be that security sensitive, but as you are scaling out, you would pull in security sensitive workloads. So the SRA helps you create that baseline that you can build on top of things. Okay, so let's now delve into the architecture. So as I said, we won't get into the depth, but just to make you aware that this is not something brand new, right? The architecture is based on some security foundations that you may be aware of, like the cloud adoption framework, which talks you how to adopt a public cloud as your business grows. It's based on AWS well-architected principle that talks about how to well-architect a workload or an application. Now, as you look into the SRA, there are some building blocks into it. But before that, we'll get two more poll questions. So, Ron, if you can put the third poll question out.
Got it. And that would be the one on organizations?
Yep.
This is a little bit of a trick question. Make sure everyone's paying attention. Again, I just want to reinforce as we see this, the importance of Avik's talk is to better understand AWS's commitment to security. And these are more tools to help you deploy your own security. It's not, correct me if I'm wrong, Avik, it's not looking underneath the hood to see exactly what AWS is doing to secure its own infrastructure, which is incredibly substantial. They're more practical guidelines to help you take care of your end user responsibilities. Is that reasonably correct?
Yes, that's your spot on. So if you have read about the shared responsibility model, this talk is more on your part of that shared responsibility model, what you need to do to secure your AWS environment.
And full disclosure, this is great insights. We might have biases, but whatever you're doing in your cloud, in your IT, great to work in AWS, but please make sure you're following these guidelines, these principles, because they're of value, whatever your technology choice is. It's all part of security best practices. All right.
Yeah,
Is that answer correct? Most people think it's a managed AWS service. Is that right?
Yeah.
All right.
That it is.
Lots of winners, almost 80, 90%. And do you want to do another poll here about accounts?
Yeah. Yes.
Just to get a little frame of mind, this just lets Vic get a better feel for the size of individuals. Obviously, as expected, these results are being skewed. A lot of people may not use AWS and not be fully aware of it, but we're skewing a little bit more towards the larger ones, which are much more than 10. As well as a lot of new opportunities for AWS. For those of you who are good enough to actually respond. All right, you got this, Avik?
Yep. Thank you. Yeah. So as the poll suggested, that most of you, what we are seeing is using more than one AWS account. And that's the right way to go, because AWS account by itself is a logical boundary, right? You need to explicitly allow something outside an AWS account. So it's a logical boundary for you. So while building the SRA, we started to build a multi-account architecture, right? So if you see on your left-hand side, this is a multi-account at a very basic multi-account architecture looks like, with different OUs and accounts within them. Again, just to be honest, this is not something that has first been done with SRA, right? We have best practices around setting an AWS environment within multiple accounts that goes deep into what different types of account are. But we took those best practices, summarized this, and looked at it from a security lens. So once you have this multiple AWS accounts, as I said, it's good that you have multiple AWS accounts, they are logical boundaries. But then the challenge comes is I need to have recurring guardrails in those multiple AWS accounts so that every account has the same level of guardrails. And once I have that, I need to somehow centrally manage those. When I say centrally, it may not be just one central team, but at least somewhere to define those, govern those, right? So how do we do that? So in the SRA, what we talk about is some baseline security services. So if you will see those security services in every account type. So the guidance here is first think about what are the guardrails that you want into every account and what are the services that you would use to leverage those guardrails. For example, like I want to know everything going on in every account and I need an organization trail, a cloud trail to do that, right? Secondly, I want to know security events that are happening or deviations. So I can use AWS Security Hub, or maybe I am already using a third-party product for that. So instead of Security Hub, I want to use that third-party because I'm familiar with it, it is well integrated. But at least it gives me the idea that I want this functionality and what tools should I use for that functionality. So then the next set of discussion would be, okay, how do I make sure that every account has those tools and services, right? So that goes into the implementation aspect. And as I said, we come back to the centralized governance. So what we do is in AWS, most of these services integrate with what we call AWS organization, and they have a delegated admin feature, right? So by default, the management account, the org management account, which is the peer account of AWS organization, is the administrator of all the services. But this is a very critical account, and we recommend you not to use that account unless otherwise necessary. So there comes this delegated administrator functionality so that you can delegate the administration of certain functionality to what we call a security tooling account or multiple security tooling accounts. Again, the SRA talks about what are the scenarios where you may have more than one security tooling account. So the last poll of the day. Around, if you can click that. Yep.
Avik, just
Okay.
as a question, these are services that you must be an AWS user in some capacity to take advantage of. Is that correct?
Yeah, these are AWS services.
So again, just to put it in context, companies like Kurt can work in your AWS and on-prem and other environments. What you're going to hear from Eric, the Centauri solution works across others. These are some unique AWS expertise. And it looks like there are lots of opportunities because the percentage of people who are not currently using these services or not sure is a lot lower, or is a lot higher than the percentage of people who are actually AWS customers. So a good opportunity for Avik to share with you why you might want to reconsider that.
Yeah, and that's again a feedback we got from customers is they look at each AWS service individually. And it takes time to adopt multiple services. And there are questions like, should I use or not use, right? So that's the objective of SRA is we show all security services at one place, their functionality, how they work together, and why you should have it, right? So if you're new, you don't have to read all the AWS services documentation. You can come to SRA and read about, and if that interests you, you can go and deep dive into the service documentation. But this is a good place to start with. So we talk about all security services, then we talk about a security tooling account, and I'm just hurrying up because of the time. So we talk about a security tooling account. As the name suggests, this is the account where you are managing all your security toolings, right? So if you see the different AWS security services, this is an account where your security engineering operations would work in and out, day in and day out. So in this account, we talk about why the services are there, what are their functionality, how you should manage them, design consideration, that you may have more than one security tooling account. For example, like you have a dedicated audit team, right? For that case, you may want to have a detective or some sort of audit capability that is in its own account itself because it is being managed by a different team. Now, those are the cases where you may have, and SRA talks in detail about why you should consider those. One other important fact that we talk about is the integration of various services. As I said earlier, the services have their own functionality, but they provide a value add when you integrate different services to work together. And that is another aspect that we call out in the SRA, which sometimes are not present in the individual service documentation. Okay, so I would just like to talk about another important account, which is the application account or the workload. So this is the account where you would host your workload on. Now, unlike other architectures, the application is very minimalistic here because the focus is security architecture, but there is an application. Now, the important thing that we want to portray in this account structure is what we call in cybersecurity or information security, defense in depth, like security at all your layers, right? So when you think about AWS, what are the different layers? So now these are logical layers, obviously, right? So you have the organization under which you have the organization unit, under which you have the account, and within account you have your network constructs, the AWS principles, and resources. So when you're thinking about putting a control, you think about these layers and how do you put controls at different layers. So this has been brought up in the application account. So if you think of these orange boxes, they are the different layers, right? So at the right is the layer that protects your account, right? So the services work at your account level and protect the whole account. Now, as you move left, these are more specific to your workloads, right? So the endpoints protects your resources within the VPC, and the agents protects your specific resources. Now, this may change because if your workload change. So if you're using serverless, now you may not have those agents, but there may be other requirements. But the thinking would not change. The principle would not change. That look at what you need to protect your account, your VPC boundaries, and things that are within your VPC. Uh, so just quickly moving on, as I said, we have a code repository, which is a public GitHub repository. It provides some sample code that you can use to implement some of the modules that we talk about. Now, we call it sample because obviously we won't encourage to take this code and directly deploy in your production environment. But these are deployment ready codes. As I said, we ensure that there is a high bar on quality, but obviously you should do your due diligence before deploying them. Now, the code repository is not just consist of code. It consists of architecture diagrams so that you can understand what are the components of the code repository, implementation guides. One other important thing we ensured is every code repository has a least privilege permission. Like the roles it is being created, it's least privilege. And most importantly, there are cleanup scripts. So if you're doing it in your dev environment, in your test environment, you test this and then you can use the cleanup. The code talks about how to set up your environment. And there are 5 stages where you set up your environment to deploy the code, to deploy the pipeline that triggers the code. So it is a self-sufficient repository that you can take a look and start your deployment. So at the end, again, just wanted to repeat the key takeaways is use the SRA to define your target state. If you already have an environment, use it to review and revise the design if necessary. Use the code to implement those architectures component. And again, if nothing else, as I said, this can be a starting point to learn about the various AWS security services, understand cloud security in general, and again, drive an organization discussion using this. Before I let you go, wanted to define some next steps. So would encourage, like within next week or so, access your current organization security architecture, right? Learn about 1 or 2 new AWS security services that you are not using. Within next 3 months, identify 1 or 2 security improvements in your security architecture. Host some lunch and learns so that the knowledge that you have gathered, you can percolate into other teams. And maybe within next 6 months, work with stakeholders that are in this program to update your security architecture and establish a mechanism so that this is a repeatable process. So it does not end at the 6-month junction. You have a process that you can repeat.